As Ben Carter boarded Flight 287, he hoped for a peaceful journey, a brief respite from his work as an undercover detective. But his calm demeanor would soon be mistaken for something sinister. Nearby sat Grace Miller, a woman haunted by fears stoked by stories she'd heard, and her gaze fixed suspiciously on Ben. Every move he made seemed to deepen her unease. By the time the plane leveled off, her anxiety had ignited into an unstoppable suspicion. Little did she know, the target of her distrust wasn't who she thought, and her relentless accusations would lead to a revelation that would leave her, and everyone on board, stunned. The loud buzz of conversation and the hum of engines greeted Ben Carter as he stepped onto Flight 287. He glanced down the packed aisle, passengers pressing bags into overhead bins and chatting with a pre-flight excitement he had nearly forgotten. Ben, an undercover detective for the NYPD, rarely had the luxury of a peaceful trip. This flight, he hoped, would be different, a quiet journey to clear his mind before a challenging assignment in Los Angeles. Ben found his seat near the emergency exit, slid his small carry-on into the overhead compartment, and settled in. The seat was perfect, away from the commotion, with a little extra legroom. He let out a sigh of relief, glad to be in his own world again, just for a while. With practiced ease, he took out his book, hoping to disappear into its pages and let the worries of his real life fade. A few rows away, Grace Miller glanced up from her magazine and noticed him immediately. She wasn't sure what it was, but something about him tugged at her attention. She shifted in her seat, peering over the glossy pages, her gaze narrowing as she watched him settle in. He was calm, too calm, she thought, as if he were hiding something beneath that composed exterior. She felt a strange, uncomfortable prickle of anxiety. The stories she'd seen on the news about dangerous strangers on flights began replaying in her mind. This man, with his silent focus and careful movements, was enough to set off a silent alarm in her head. Grace kept glancing over, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As a flight attendant passed by, Grace raised her hand with a polite but urgent gesture. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The attendant, Linda, paused, her professional smile steady. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Grace's eyes flicked toward Ben, who was now absorbed in his book. She leaned slightly toward Linda, lowering her voice as if sharing a dire secret. "That man, near the emergency exit," she said, glancing nervously at Ben. "Is it safe to have him sitting there?" Linda followed her gaze and spotted Ben, who was still lost in his book. Her smile remained polite, though her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing Grace's concern. "Ma'am, I assure you, every passenger has been thoroughly screened, and our seating arrangements are safe," Linda said kindly, her tone reassuring. "There's nothing to worry about." Grace forced a smile but felt the prickling of doubt intensify. "It's just, with all that's been happening in the news, it doesn't hurt to be cautious, right?" Linda nodded, maintaining her calm professionalism. "If there's anything specific you're concerned about, please let me know. We want all our passengers to feel safe and comfortable." She gave Grace a gentle nod and continued down the aisle, leaving Grace to her thoughts. Grace shifted uncomfortably, her eyes drifting back to Ben. He was still reading, unaware of her scrutiny. Her fingers drummed against the armrest as a wave of irritation bubbled up inside her. How could the flight attendants be so dismissive? She had tried to voice her concerns, but it felt as if no one was taking her seriously. Grace watched as Ben closed his book briefly to take out a small pill bottle from his bag, check the label, and tuck it back inside. He seemed calm, but that calmness only seemed to reinforce her unease. What could he possibly be hiding in that bag? Her mind began to spin, imagining possibilities that felt more real with each passing minute. The engines roared louder as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board and explaining the flight's schedule. Grace tried to relax, sinking back into her seat, but she kept her eyes fixed on Ben, her mind racing with scenarios of what he might be planning. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Grace glanced around at the other passengers, hoping someone else had noticed him. But everyone seemed blissfully unaware, chatting, reading, or watching the pre-flight safety video with disinterest. The fact that no one else seemed worried only heightened her frustration. How could everyone be so blind? She thought bitterly. If something happened, they would all regret ignoring the signs she was clearly seeing now. As the plane lifted off, Grace's pulse quickened, and her grip on the armrests tightened. Ben's calmness contrasted sharply with her growing tension, feeding her unease. She glanced over at him again, watching as he resumed reading, looking entirely unbothered. By now, Grace's suspicions had fully taken root, a relentless anxiety that tightened around her like a vice. If no one else was willing to take action, then maybe, just maybe, she would have to. As Flight 287 climbed into the clouds, Grace's anxiety simmered, refusing to subside. She glanced again at Ben Carter, who was flipping through his book, seemingly engrossed and unaware of her attention. The way he periodically glanced down at his bag, his hands carefully zipping and unzipping it, only deepened her unease. To her, it was evidence of a sinister plan, carefully concealed beneath his calm exterior. Grace shifted in her seat, barely able to look away. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't control. She was sure that he was hiding something. She had read countless stories about suspicious passengers and mysterious packages on planes. She had seen news reports of people who seemed perfectly ordinary until they turned out to be anything but. In her mind, the pieces fit all too well. Just then, Linda, the flight attendant, passed by again with a tray of drinks. Grace seized the opportunity to try again, her voice low and tense. "Excuse me," Grace said, gesturing Linda over once more. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I really think you need to take a closer look at that man. He keeps checking that bag of his, like he's nervous about something inside it." Linda, ever the professional, glanced politely at Ben and then turned back to Grace, her face kind but calm. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but as I mentioned, unless there's a clear reason to check someone's belongings, we can't interfere without cause. Mr. Carter has done nothing out of the ordinary." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Nothing out of the ordinary? That's how these things always go. People always act normal until they don't. I've seen it happen too many times. I think you're putting everyone here at risk by ignoring this. Linda kept her voice gentle but firm. Our security measures are thorough, ma'am. I assure you, everything is under control. She gave Grace a slight nod before moving on, leaving Grace fuming. Grace's frustration mounted. The dismissive responses, the unwillingness of others to see what she saw, these only confirmed in her mind that she was the only one with the courage to recognize the threat. With growing agitation, she glanced around at the other passengers, hoping someone might share her concern. Beside her sat a middle-aged man absorbed in a crossword puzzle. Summoning her nerve, Grace leaned toward him and whispered, "Excuse me, have you noticed that man by the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The man looked up, blinking in mild surprise, then cast a quick glance toward Ben. He shrugged dismissively. "I don't know. He looks fine to me. What's the issue?" Grace felt her patience fraying. "The issue is that he keeps checking his bag, like he's hiding something. I tried telling the flight attendant, but they don't care." The man looked back at her with a polite but distant smile. "If the crew's not worried, then it's probably nothing. I think we're safe." But Grace was far from reassured. She tried again, leaning across the aisle to speak to a young woman who was watching a movie on her tablet. As Flight 287 cruised above the clouds, Grace's patience was wearing thin. The hum of the engines, the faint clinking of drink carts, the quiet murmurs of other passengers, it all blended together, but Grace's mind was elsewhere, focused intently on the man she was sure posed a threat. She watched Ben Carter's every move, every casual glance out the window, each time he reached down to adjust his bag. With each unzipping of the bag, Grace's anxiety grew sharper, her thoughts twisting. Her mind replayed news stories and imagined scenarios where ordinary people turned out to be anything but. She couldn't understand why no one else saw what she saw. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Grace took a deep breath and decided she would have to act herself. She unbuckled her seatbelt, steeling herself for what she was sure was the right thing to do. In one swift motion, she stood up, her voice ringing out louder than she intended, slicing through the soft murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes locked on Ben. "I need to know what's in that bag of yours." A ripple of surprise swept through the nearby passengers as heads turned, their expressions a mix of curiosity and alarm. Ben looked up, caught off guard, his calm expression slipping for just a moment as he processed the unexpected confrontation. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but cautious. "There's nothing in my bag that should concern you. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me continue my flight in peace." But Grace wasn't swayed. Her tone sharpened as she pressed on. "I've been watching you since we boarded. You keep checking that bag, hiding something, I know it. I demand that you show us what's inside." By now, other passengers were exchanging uneasy glances, and a hush had fallen over the cabin. Linda, the flight attendant, quickly stepped in, her face a mask of concern and calm. "Ma'am," Linda said, her voice firm, "please sit down. You're disturbing the other passengers. Mr. Carter has done nothing wrong." But Grace's gaze didn't leave Ben's. Her voice wavered but stayed loud. "You're all ignoring it, he's hiding something dangerous, and I'm not going to sit here while you all pretend nothing's wrong." Ben took a slow, calming breath, aware of the growing tension around him. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on him. This wasn't how he had hoped to spend this flight, and certainly not how he expected to be treated. "Ma'am," he said again, quieter now, "there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight, like everyone else." Grace's face reddened, her frustration and fear bubbling over. "A peaceful flight," she scoffed. "You expect us to believe that? What are you hiding?" Linda stepped between them, her hand lightly touching Grace's arm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. Let's not cause a scene here. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll have to notify the captain." But Grace's suspicion had fully taken root, and she wasn't ready to back down. She pointed at Ben's bag, her voice quivering with conviction. "If there's nothing to hide, then let him show us. He's checking that bag over and over, it's not normal." Linda took a deep breath, glancing from Grace to Ben and then back to Grace. She weighed her options, wanting to de-escalate the tension before it spread any further. She motioned for another flight attendant, Jim, who stood a few rows back, ready to assist. "Ma'am, please sit down," Linda said, her tone firmer. "We will not tolerate further disruption." In the face of Linda's stern gaze, Grace hesitated. She could feel the judgmental stares from passengers around her. But her need to expose Ben overpowered her embarrassment. Seeing no other way to resolve the situation peacefully, Ben looked at Linda and nodded. He unzipped his bag slowly, calmly, pulling out a small, clear plastic case with a label. He held it up for both Linda and Grace to see. "This is medication I take for a heart condition. That's what I've been checking." Linda's shoulders relaxed, relieved that Ben had remained calm. She looked back at Grace with a firm gaze. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. Mr. Carter has shown you there's nothing to worry about." But Grace only took a step back, her eyes flickering with disbelief. She wasn't ready to accept this as the truth. Her gaze darted around, searching for someone, anyone, who might back her up. "He's lying," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper but thick with anger. "He has to be. People like him, they always have a story. You're all too blind to see it." Linda, exhausted by Grace's resistance, gently but firmly placed a hand on her shoulder. As Linda and Jim returned to their positions, Ben took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. He opened his book again, attempting to focus, but he could still feel Grace's burning gaze on him, her disbelief now mixed with embarrassment and resentment. And though she had sat down, he knew this was far from over. "Excuse me, miss," she whispered, trying to keep her voice down. "Have you seen the man by the exit? I think he's hiding something." The young woman raised her eyebrows, glanced briefly at Ben, and shook her head with an awkward smile. "I'm not really sure, he just seems like he's reading. Maybe it's nothing?" "Maybe," Grace said, her voice growing strained. "But what if it's not? I'm not the only one who feels uneasy. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" The young woman offered a sympathetic look, but her eyes were uncertain. Grace felt her irritation grow. How could everyone be so complacent, so willing to brush aside something that seemed so obvious. Her pulse quickened as her gaze fell back on Ben. She was beginning to feel truly alone in her convictions, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't see the danger she knew was real. As the plane cruised along, Grace's nerves frayed further with each passing minute. The unease she had first felt had now morphed into something darker, something harder to control. Every time Ben unzipped his bag, her anxiety surged, her heart pounding as she watched his every move. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching the beginning of something terrible, and if no one else would do anything, she would have to be ready. She sat back in her seat, a sense of determination hardening within her. If no one else would listen, if even the crew ignored her, then it would be up to her to protect everyone on board. The silence that fell over the cabin was tense and heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engines. Passengers had gone back to their seats, but the discomfort lingered in the air. Most people avoided eye contact, casting quick, cautious glances in Ben's direction. A few sympathetic eyes caught his, offering silent apologies or understanding nods. But Grace's state remained fixed, a seething mixture of resentment and suspicion that seemed unwilling to die. Ben tried to focus on his book, but the unease gnawed at him. He had faced prejudice before, but rarely in such a public and isolating way. It wasn't lost on him that Grace's suspicions weren't based on his actions, but rather her own deeply ingrained fears. He considered letting it go, simply tolerating the discomfort until they landed. But he could feel that the situation was teetering on the edge of something worse. Taking a deep breath, Ben made a decision. He would put an end to this now, for himself and for everyone else on this plane who had been dragged into Grace's paranoia. He closed his book and looked up, his voice calm but loud enough for those around to hear. "Excuse me, everyone," he said, holding his hands up slightly to catch people's attention. "I realize there's been some concern. I'd like to clear things up once and for all." As conversations quieted, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Detective Ben Carter," he announced, his tone steady. "I'm with the New York Police Department, working undercover. This badge is real, and you're welcome to verify it with the department." A few gasps rippled through the cabin, and many passengers now watched him with expressions of surprise and relief. Some exchanged whispers, reassessing their assumptions. Even Linda, who had remained professional through the ordeal, looked relieved, her respect for Ben's composure clear in her expression. Grace, however, sat rigid, her face flushed with both anger and disbelief. She scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. "Oh, please. A badge? How do we know that's even real? It's just a prop, a cover. You could be using it to fool us." Ben turned to Grace, meeting her defiant glare with steady eyes. "Ma'am, if you're still concerned, you're welcome to call my department once we land. They'll confirm my identity. I understand your fear, but I assure you, I'm not a threat to anyone here." Linda took a step forward, her voice calm but firm as she addressed Grace. "Ma'am, Detective Carter has been more than patient. He's shown you proof of his credentials, and we've seen that he has nothing dangerous. I need you to trust our judgment and respect the safety of all passengers on this flight." Grace's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking between Ben and Linda, still unwilling to let go of her suspicions. No, this isn't right," she muttered, her voice trembling. "You're all being deceived. He's hiding something, I know it." The tension in the cabin rose once again, and Ben knew that further arguing would only make things worse. He looked back at Linda, nodding in silent agreement that he would sit back down and let it rest. "Ma'am," Linda said quietly but sternly to Grace, "if you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll have no choice but to contact the captain. Any more disturbance, and you'll be escorted by security upon landing." Grace's face fell, the threat of authority finally breaking through her resistance. Her eyes darted around the cabin, catching the disapproving looks from passengers, the silent judgment that she had tried so hard to ignore. With a bitter glance toward Ben, she sank back into her seat, her mouth set in a tight, frustrated line. "Fine," she muttered, crossing her arms. "But when something happens, don't say I didn't warn you." Ben exhaled, finally feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He gave a respectful nod to Linda, who returned it with a small, supportive smile. He sat back down, hoping that this would be the end of it. He opened his book once more, but his focus was far from the words on the page. He knew all too well that prejudice didn't vanish with an explanation. The plane settled back into an uneasy silence, but the discomfort lingered like a faint aftertaste. Passengers shifted in their seats, casting wary glances toward both Ben and Grace, unsure of how to feel after witnessing the heated exchange. Ben could feel the weight of these stares, the mix of sympathy and curiosity that often followed after moments like this. He tried to focus on his book, telling himself that this was just another experience he'd add to the list, another instance of ignorance he'd endured with patience. But no matter how many times he'd faced situations like this, it never grew easier. Today, however, he was determined not to let it get to him. The stakes were higher, and he knew that his patience and restraint had done more to de-escalate the situation than any confrontation would have. Several minutes later, Linda approached Ben's seat, her voice low and respectful. "Detective Carter, I just wanted to say thank you for your patience. I'm truly sorry you had to go through this." Ben gave her a polite smile. "Thank you, Linda. I appreciate your professionalism. You handled it well." Linda's expression softened, and she gave him a nod of gratitude before moving down the aisle, checking on other passengers and offering smiles to help ease the remaining tension. Meanwhile, Grace sat stiffly in her seat, her mind racing with unresolved anger and humiliation. She couldn't understand why everyone seemed to trust Ben's explanation so easily, why no one saw what she was certain she had uncovered. As Linda passed Grace's row, Grace leaned in, her voice an indignant whisper. "You're making a mistake, you know. I've seen people like him pretend to be harmless until it's too late. He's fooling everyone." Linda's calm expression didn't falter. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was a certain intensity in Grace's gaze that unsettled her. "Ma'am, I assure you, we are fully trained in handling these situations. Mr. Carter has shown us all he has nothing to hide. For the safety of everyone on board, I need you to remain calm and cooperative for the rest of the flight." Grace glared, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she stayed silent. She had no allies in this, the passengers, the crew, everyone was against her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was the only one brave enough to acknowledge it. But now, with Linda's warning ringing in her ears, she knew she had no choice but to keep her thoughts to herself. Ben settled back in his seat, sensing the atmosphere easing slightly. A few passengers gave him encouraging nods or brief smiles, subtle gestures of support that he accepted with quiet gratitude. As the plane continued on its way, Ben tried to let go of the incident, reminding himself that he had acted with restraint and dignity. The situation was under control, and soon enough, this flight would be nothing more than an unpleasant memory. As Flight 287 began its descent toward Los Angeles, a sense of collective relief rippled through the cabin. The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign and the captain's announcement gave passengers something concrete to focus on, a reminder that soon they'd be on solid ground and away from the tension that had defined the journey. Ben Carter felt the plane dip, watching the skyline of Los Angeles come into view. He placed his book back in his bag and made sure his medication was securely packed. A calm focus had returned to him, though he was aware of the lingering stares and whispers around him. He was determined to walk off this plane with his dignity intact, leaving the incident and all it symbolized behind him. Grace, however, sat rigidly in her seat, her face flushed with an uncomfortable mixture of frustration and humiliation. Despite the descent, her hands remained clamped onto the armrests, her knuckles white. She avoided looking at the other passengers, feeling the weight of their judgment but refusing to acknowledge it. Her mind raced with defiant thoughts. She was still convinced she had been right, that somehow Ben had fooled them all, and she was the only one who had truly seen the danger. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, passengers began murmuring and shifting in their seats, eager to disembark. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of unbuckling seatbelts and the rustling of luggage. Ben stayed seated, waiting for the others to gather their things, content to avoid any further confrontation. Linda approached him as he prepared to leave. Her face showed a mixture of apology and professionalism. "Detective Carter, thank you again for your patience and understanding. We've contacted airport security, and they'll be escorting her off the plane first." I'm sorry you had to go through this. Ben nodded, appreciating her concern. You handled it well, Linda. I'm glad it didn't escalate further. Linda offered him a small, sympathetic smile before stepping back to manage the disembarkation. Ben watched as passengers moved toward the exit, some casting him glances of acknowledgement, others looking away in discomfort. Grace, however, remained firmly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her, her mind refusing to accept the turn of events. Finally, two uniformed airport security officers entered the cabin and moved toward Grace. One of them, a tall man with a steady, calm demeanor, leaned down to speak with her in a low voice. Ma'am, we'd like you to come with us. There's been an incident report filed regarding your conduct during the flight. Grace's face paled, but she managed to summon a defiant glare. An incident report? I was trying to keep everyone safe. He's the one you should be questioning, not me. The officer remained calm, his voice firm. Ma'am, we need to address the concerns raised by the flight crew and the disturbance that took place. Please come with us. Seeing that she had no choice, Grace reluctantly stood, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. She cast a final, resentful glance toward Ben, who met her gaze with quiet composure, refusing to engage further. With the officers gently guiding her, Grace was led down the aisle, her protests trailing off as she exited the plane. Ben waited a moment longer, allowing the remaining passengers to leave, then stood up and retrieved his bag. He made his way down the aisle, catching Linda's eye one last time. She nodded, her expression appreciative, and he returned the nod, grateful for her professionalism. Stepping off the plane, he felt the cool air of the jet bridge wash over him, grounding him in the reality outside of Grace's prejudice and paranoia. In the bustling terminal, Ben spotted Grace being led toward a quiet area for questioning. Her defiance had faded into a look of resignation, though her lips still moved in muted protests. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the incident begin to lift as he moved toward the baggage claim area. Around him, other passengers from Flight 287 murmured, some casting glances toward Grace, others simply glad to have the experience behind them. They looked to Ben with various expressions: sympathy, curiosity, discomfort, and he acknowledged them with quiet dignity. He was no stranger to misunderstandings and assumptions, but each encounter weighed on him. Today, though, he felt a renewed sense of resilience, knowing he had handled himself with calmness and strength. As Ben waited for his luggage, he took a moment to reflect. Today's flight had been a reminder of the prejudices that still lingered, the hidden fears that could be projected onto anyone, regardless of who they truly were. But it was also a reminder of his own resolve, his commitment to rise above judgment, and his faith in truth and dignity over conflict. He collected his bag and made his way toward the terminal's exit, his steps steady, his mind ready to focus on the assignment awaiting him. Grace's words and accusations faded into the background, becoming just another moment to learn from, another reminder to carry with him as he moved forward. As he passed through the bustling airport crowd, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been difficult, but it had reinforced what he already knew, that some battles are best fought with patience and restraint, and that even in moments of misunderstanding, dignity remains one's strongest armor. In the background, the passengers of Flight 287 dispersed into the Los Angeles terminal, each carrying their own reflections on the incident. Some may never remember the details of the flight, but Ben knew that he would carry this day with him, a testament to his resilience, a reminder that no judgment could shake the strength of who he truly was.